Let's begin with a meditation. Before I begin, I have just a quick practical question. A couple of people contacted me last week or during the weekend, said that they didn't get the mailing with the email with the link to the recording this week. And the odd thing is that when I checked the mailing, their email addresses were in the list, so it's kind of odd that they didn't get it. And so I wanted to ask if anybody else is aware of not having gotten that email this week, to see if something peculiar happened with the server or something. So I guess the mic's not on, but here I'll unmute for a moment. In case you want to speak up or raise your hand if you didn't get the mailing last week. Okay, so as far as we know, just a couple of people. So that's an oddity, probably just a funny little glitch. Let's go back to muting. Last week, there was a question that came up that I said that I would get back to, that Lena brought up. It's actually a couple. One is going to be sort of an integral part of the discussion today, so that'll just come as we go. But the other was about a question concerning the lineage, two lineages really, a comparison. And I did talk about it briefly, but on kind of reflecting on it later, I thought I would make another comment or two. Mina's question was about the two particular lineages. One is often called the Trans-Himalayan lineage. It's familiar to people who are interested in certain forms of Western esotericism. We call it Western esotericism, but really it's a blend of Eastern and Western teachings, and it was initially talked about by Madame Blavatsky, and then quite a few other people kind of picked up that thread and under the inspiration of the same lineage have given out teachings or developed teaching organizations and centers and schools. And so Alice Bailey and Helena Roerich and her husband and the Agni Yoga teachings, and Steiner kind of spun off from that but gave it a different spin, and many other things have kind of grown out of that. So that was kind of inspired by a particular lineage, this Trans-Himalayan lineage, that although having its kind of main headquarters in the Himalayas last century, well, 2 centuries ago now, in the 1800s, really was spread widely throughout the world, particularly into not only Tibet and India, but also the Middle East and Europe, and is understood really to be ultimately interrelated with other forms of the same more universal school, a kind of planetary lineage that's manifest throughout the world. But it does have different sub-schools, and Selena's question had to do with kind of comparing that one, which is one that I'm particularly strongly connected to in this life, to another one that is headed by a master called, among other things, Sri Guru Babaji, who Yogananda famously revealed to the world in the 1940s in his autobiography, where he simply called Babaji, or Maha Avatar Babaji. And some of the folks in this group, I have an interest in both groups, and so there's been a question bouncing around about what is the relationship between them. It's actually a question I brought up with a fellow named Sri M, who's a member of that lineage too. We talked somewhat about that several years ago. And it's really a profound and kind of interesting question. But to keep it brief, I did want to make a couple of other comments. Mainly what we have to go on in the physical world as to the sort of nature of Sri Guru Babaji's lineage is that it's been particularly associated with several individuals who have come forward in the last little over a century, starting with Lahiri Mahasya, who gave out a teaching called Kriya Yoga, which is kind of a blend of Hatha Yoga with a particular emphasis on pranayama, but with some elements of Tantra and certainly drawing on Raja Yoga and Advaita Vedanta, sort of a blend of different elements of Hindu teachings. One of the differences that I've noticed is in the two forms, that Sri M is another modern expression of that lineage, but there's others who have kind of taken up the stream that came through Lahiri Mahasya. They're very similar, the two, Sri M's and Lahiri Mahasya's teachings of Kriya Yoga. And that's primarily what we have to go on in terms of, it seems like Sri Guru Babaji and some of these advanced masters that work with him have a broad mastery of and familiarity with especially Hinduism, certainly an overlap into other traditions as well. One of the differences that we can see just at that level is that it seems as though the Trans-Himalayan masters have a more specific and strong interest in integrating a lot of traditions into their focus. Both of these traditions, by the way, have a strong tantric element to them. And that's one of the reasons I think that the theme came up in our webinar on Tantra. And what I found, by the way, is that virtually all of these great traditions that are kind of senior planetary lineages, manifestations of a more comprehensive kind of vision, invariably have a deep tantric core to their vision. They might have different styles of expressing that, invariably they do. And for instance, one of the differences is that although both lineages are somewhat sort of inclusive and encompassing, there does seem to be a leaning a bit towards Tibetan Buddhism. The senior master in Trans-Himalayan lineage, one that was often called the Ma Chohan, means sort of great lord. He lived in Tibet and outwardly affiliated with the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. And so one way to sort of sense a potential leaning or difference is a kind of Buddhist versus Hindu leaning, because although there's a way in which we see that Sri Guru Babaji's lineage also integrated with Sikhs and Buddhists and Sufis and so on, the core teaching is essentially Hindu. The references are primarily made to teachings like the Upanishads, which are Hindu teachings, and so on. So on a practical level, in terms of how these two lineages manifest, I would say that a difference is that because of a Buddhist flavor that's stronger perhaps in the Trans-Himalayan Blavatsky version. I say Blavatsky because she was kind of the first person that brought this teaching to the world. There's a stronger emphasis on teachings like Bodhisattvahood. naturally, any of these lineages puts an emphasis on service. But we see kind of more overtly in the teachings, like in Buddhism, Mahayana Buddhism, and Tibetan Buddhism, Vajrayana Buddhism, or Tantric Buddhism, we see a kind of fundamental emphasis on bodhisattvahood, where at the foundation of the path, you're encouraged to cultivate a spirit of dedicating the path to the awakening of all beings, and that generosity and compassion therefore become foundational to that path. And that's explicit in the teachings in a very strong way from the foundation. So although we see a spirit of that in other forms as well, like I think talked about encountering another Chinese master who was representative of a Chinese version of this planetary lineage. And that bodhisattvic element wasn't quite as explicit again. And similarly, I would say in the Sri Guru Babaji teaching, the degree of emphasis is a little different. So that, for instance, even in the style of practice, there's a bit more of in Buddhism, of a kind of a full presence in the moment to this world, and a bodhisattvic spirit of engaging in the world. And so it's not a black and white distinction at all, but maybe a bit of a flavor, a leaning one way or the other. Also, the Buddhist lineage has a strong second ray quality to it. And so we see in Buddhism, and certainly in the manifestations of the Trans-Himalayan lineage, a kind of a very strong wisdom dimension to it. So in books like The Secret Doctrine, for instance, or the Bailey books, there's a very sophisticated teaching that's given out. Whereas folks like Lahiri Mahasya and Sri M have tended to emphasize a kind of simple style of transmitting the Dharma. And each has its own value. There's a powerful clarity that can come from keeping things simple. And so that's an advantage there in a sense. And it's sort of one of its advantages is it tends to make a teaching like that accessible to a larger number of people. But you could perhaps say that the Trans-Himalayan, for lack of a better word, in fact, Sri Guru Babaji's lineage is really Trans-Himalayan also technically. Their abode, you might say, there is in the Trans-Himalayan range as well. But in a different sort of way, but in a sense similarly. So it's not ideal to kind of call the one Trans-Himalayan and the other not. As far as things like householders versus renunciates, both traditions seem to embrace both. So in that sense, I wouldn't say that one is sort of more fully tantric than the other. But in reality, if anything, they probably kind of lean a little bit towards the renunciate style. That, in my feeling, is part of the difference. I see my own work as sort of furthering this, the work of this planetary lineage, and working with the same kind of foundational vision of it, a fundamentally non-dual understanding of reality and a very tantric approach, but kind of giving it a different spin in that the senior practitioners of these other traditions have tended more often to be renunciates. And even in the form of, for instance, the form of Tibetan Buddhism that the Mahachohan was affiliated with was the Gelugpa order. And the Gelugpa order is primarily renunciate order. The Nyingmapa order, which is the original Tibetan Buddhist, more affiliated with Padmasambhava, and actually was more lay-oriented, and had renunciates, but also thoroughly embraced the lay life. And Tsongkhapa, the founder of the Gelugpa order, that the Dalai Lama was is affiliated with more, and that the Trans-Himalayan group was affiliated, was actually kind of going back to the original roots of Buddhism and emphasizing being renunciates more. So they had students who were lay people, like Alice Bailey, who was married and worked and so on. But their kind of core style as masters, hidden great ones, is more towards the renunciate meaning. And I think we're moving toward, in a sense, what's emerging in the world, and especially in the West, in places like North America and elsewhere in the world, is a new version of this lineage that is kind of sponsored by these groups, like the Chinese and Sri Guru Babaji's and the so-called Trans-Himalayan, but is also a new expression of that. So it's almost like a new generation where they're the elders, they're the parents, and they're supporting the birth of children that are growing up and growing into embodying a new generation and a new expression of the Dharma. And we're figuring out our own version of that, a new manifestation of that that's suitable to the time, suitable to sort of an evolving understanding of the Dharma. So even though I talk about an affiliation, actually I feel a strong connection to both of those lineages, among others. I also feel like I want to clarify that the spirit of my work is in this new emergence archetype, rather than merely transmitting to a new environment a specific orientation that's already established by that lineage elsewhere in the world, for instance. So, and in that context, certainly our new orientation is very much more balanced in terms of appreciating the importance of equally honoring both the renunciate style and the householder style. There's even traditions, for instance, in the Swami order in India, or certain old school Buddhist styles, that in fact hierarchalize and say that the preferred practitioner, it's sort of like if two people are sort of vying for the attention of the teacher, and one of them is a renunciate and the other is a householder, there had been a tendency to value the renunciate more. Or there's even ceremonies in places like Thailand, for instance, where if there's a group that are taking the precepts and being initiated into the order, they'll have like a procession, and that procession will how people participate in it will mirror how they're valued in that tradition. And so male renunciates walk up front, and then male lay people walk after them, and then female renunciates walk after them, and then female lay people after that. So it's males over females, and it's renunciates over householders. So these are, the Trans-Himalayan lineage doesn't think that way, but these are kind of old cultural influences that are still around in the world. And of course, they've been outgrown to some extent in different areas. And in many ways, I think that these advanced lineages that we're talking about, like Sri Guru Babaji's, are on the cutting edge of extricating themselves from these ways of thinking as advanced planetary masters. But it's possible that we still need to keep deepening that transformation, keep expressing an even more radically non-dual vision, and even more profound tantric vision that keeps transforming our understanding of how to manifest enlightenment in the world. So that's part of what I think is the opportunity of a new expression of the planetary lineage in the world, a new expression of the Dharma. Okay, so perhaps that's enough about that now. Nina, since you brought up the question that to a little bit of that sharing, then I'll just check in and see if there was any follow-ups or reactions to what I just shared.
No, but just to thank you for deepening this. It was exactly perhaps this kind of a nuances I was seeking for. I was kind of intuiting myself and had pondered this issue. So you clarified it quite beautifully. So thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Sure. Any other comments or questions before we move on to another topic? Okay.
I tried. My
Yes.
short question. You called. I got the name of the Trans-Himalayan lineage. That's the name of that one, and the other one is. Did you simply call it the Sri Guru Babaji lineage, or is it another? Is there a name for that one?
You know, not that I know of. It's considered, many of the masters that are part of it are considered part of the Nath lineage, or Sampradaya, which is the Sanskrit term for a tradition. But I've seen people like Sri M say that in fact Sri Guru Babaji himself is beyond these lineage distinctions. So if that's the case, then we can't really reduce Sri Guru Babaji's lineage to say it's the Nath, the same as the Nath lineage. There does seem to be strong representation of Nath teachings, though, in Sri Guru Babaji's teachings. What we don't know, though, is whether there are other streams coming from Sri Guru Babaji into the world that express different, maybe a bhakti approach, or maybe something more tantric, or something more, like Raja Yoga. Certainly, Sri Guru Babaji's presence is widely felt throughout, especially that part of the world, the Himalayas and India. And my own sense is that he interacts with a wide variety of different kinds of initiates, more often than not in a kind of quiet way where he interacts with them, but they don't necessarily talk about that they know him, or if they do, it's to a small number of people. And that in many contexts probably empowers them in part within the context of whatever lineage that they're part of. Although it's interesting to note that he does seem to have chosen on two primary occasions now. First, in the Yogananda transmission that goes back to Lahiri Mahasya, and then again in a more contemporary cycle with Sri M, to have given out the same teaching, Kriya Yoga, which, as I said, is kind of a blend of Raja Yoga and Hatha Yoga, some fundamental practices from Hatha Yoga, and so on. The Nath tradition is more or less the Hatha Yoga tradition, but Hatha Yoga in the broader meaning of not just asanas as you see in the West. When people say Hatha Yoga, it's mostly postures with maybe some pranayama. But the deeper Hatha Yoga teachings actually was essentially a tantric and primarily Kundalini yoga style that emphasized, a whole spectrum of practices. And Kriya Yoga is a particular package of that. It's a particular version that doesn't really emphasize asanas very much, but more a certain collection of pranayama practices and some other things as well. So that still leaves that a bit mysterious, exactly what his lineage is, in terms of how to name it. What is this exactly? But I think one of the things that we can say is that there's something to be said for the simple reality of where is a master incarnate? Where's their physical body located? Because they're going to tend to be somewhat of an expression of a regional manifestation. And so, in spite of the fact that some of these great traditions are very inclusive the senior members of these lineages often, have a physical location somewhere. And so the Mahachohan, being in Tibet and affiliated with Tibetan Buddhism, kind of gives a spin to that whole order. So even some of the other masters affiliated with that tradition, like Serapis, who was born Greek and lived in Egypt during the time period where all of this came to light, in the late 1800s, was obviously well versed in Buddhism and would give out, there's letters from him, for instance, collected amongst letters that these masters wrote at that time. And in one of the letters, for instance, Serapis is quoting the Dhammapada, which is a Buddhist text. And in the signature sort of end of another one of the letters, I think it was written by Tuitit Bey, he said that this sort of like this decision that's expressed in the letter came from three of the masters in this subgroup called the Brotherhood of Luxor, which is connected to the Mahachohan tradition. It's all one thing. And it says next to Serapis's name, Serapis Bey, and then Ellora section. Now that's interesting. Ellora is actually a series of cave monasteries in India that's affiliated with particularly Hindus and Buddhists. So here we have Serapis, born a Greek and living in Egypt, and outwardly particularly specializing in the Coptic tradition, but initiated into Buddhism, and even calling his subdivision the Ellora section, which is an Indian location. So there's a deep interblending, ultimately with a strong connection in that lineage to Tibet and to Buddhism, but with a profound embrace of other traditions, especially Sufism, Christianity, Judaism, the Greek traditions, Gnosticism, and certainly Hinduism and Buddhism as a sort of core. But with a spin, I think that we could argue that there's a spin there. Similarly, Sri Guru Babaji was incarnate in India, and his teachings seem to draw very strongly on the Hindu tradition. The terminology that's used to name him is Sanskrit and Hindu imagery and terminology. The teachings, the references, it's references to the Bhagavad Gita, it's references to the Upanishads, to the Yoga Sutras, and to the Nath tradition, and so on. So it's very strongly built up around a Hindu spin, a Hindu flavor. So much so that I think I might have said this before, but there's a bit of a temptation, call it an intuition if you want, that it may very well be that, this intuition is fairly strong for me, that in fact the Mahachohan was an incarnation of the Bodhisattva Maitreya, and subsequently was considered the head of a kind of second-ray Buddhist-centered but very integral planetary lineage, and that ultimately all these lineages are interconnected. So it's really one group, but there's just subdivisions, and that Sri Guru Babaji may very well be being that in both the Hindu and the trans-Himalayan hidden sort of mesoteric teachings is referred to as the Manu, and is on the first ray, kind of the Shiva ray. And in fact, interestingly, in some of the teachings that have come out in the last century or so that emphasize the the sort of order of this hidden planetary lineage and its different adepts and the different teachings. Well, one of the things that's interesting that was emphasized is that the second ray aspect of that tradition kind of works more with the soul of the transmission. It's the teaching ray, and it emphasizes wisdom and the kind of inner aspect of the teaching. It's kind of like when we were talking about the two accumulations recently in Buddhism, where you have a sort of mind wisdom development in our nature and a transformation of our bodies and our karma, the karmic accumulation, the merit, sometimes it's called karmic merit. So we grow in transforming our character by acting positively and bringing about changes and doing awakening Kundalini transforms our bodies, but we also transform our consciousness through generating intuitive wisdom. That's like the soul of our transformation and awakening. So it's like the second ray is more directed at that wisdom accumulation. And according to folks like Blavatsky, the Manu actually has more to do with cultivating the body type of an emerging culture. And practices like Hatha Yoga and Kriya practices and working with Kundalini transform our physical body, our etheric body, and our subtle bodies and bring about a transformation of that second accumulation, the accumulation of sort of like, in other words, the Manu works more with the form side, interestingly, and the Machoan with the consciousness side. Now, that's not a black and white distinction. These two approaches overlap profoundly, so it's just a leaning. And you find these same kind of practices like Kriya Yoga practices in the other tradition. You find consciousness teachings in the Kriya tradition. But, you know, I think it's pretty obvious that there is that leaning of like, that's why, for instance, some of the deep fundamental practices of Buddhism are about the quality of presence, soul presence, the depth of realization, cultivating the witness and realization and insight and non-dual awareness, and compassionate presence. And then there's a heavy emphasis in practices like Kriya Yoga and Hatha Yoga on awakening consciousness by purifying the vehicles through practices like asanas and pranayama. So that's a little bit more just to, you know, stimulate some intuitions about the differences between these approaches, something to think about. But also keeping in mind, these are deep mysteries. We're always gaining more insight into these things. So it's something to just sort of let be there in the background of our awareness, and more insight will invariably come about the reality of these things. And at the same time, about, you know, what are we up to as sort of very early stage preliminary birthers of a new emergent Dharma, a new spirituality? What feels right to us? What's our style? That's an even more central ongoing investigation that we're all involved in. Okay, so that kind of helps tap into some of that, reconnect to that. So let's move on now. I sent out a people. Oh. Did you have a follow-up, Lars?
Yeah.
Okay.
And it was about Sri Guru Babaji again. And I'm a little bit uncertain. Maybe I have already asked you and you already gave me the answer, but right now I'm thinking that it sounds like there's quite a bit of similarities between Sanat Kumara and Sri Guru Babaji in their description, that they are very young, their body is very young, and they are kind of behind all the rays, etc. Am I right that you have already told me that they're probably not the same? And if they,
yeah, I mean,
so what are their, what's the difference between them? If you can, if there's any sense in talking about the difference.
You know, I think in a certain sense, the archetype is very similar. And so I've had that wondering myself a number of times, which finally led, you know, a kind of a main way that I grow in my understanding of things just in general, the Dharma essentially, but also some of these more esoteric questions is I simply pursue my practice, and insight just comes when it does, for whatever reason, things just ripen, they come to light, things are illuminated, veils are lifted, and it kind of all happens in its own organic way. But also, frankly, sometimes I may have a theme that's been around, just sort of bouncing around in somewhere in my consciousness. And so occasionally I'll do a more directed investigation. And at some point I have become more curious about this question of the nature of this master, Sri Guru Babaji. And so I did pointedly more than once take that into meditation and investigate it. And what I got, both in terms of dialogue with inner beings as well as my own intuitive perceptions, is it feels like he's very intimately connected to this being Sanat Kumara, but is not the same. So that's my current sense. I'm pretty confident about that, but such as it is. So are we good then, Lars?
Well, my question was if you could say something about in what way they differ in, or what kind of function they have in if there's any, or are they just so much in the same kind of position that they are doing practically the same thing in a harmony with each other, hopefully?
It would be more like to say that at one level, the planetary lineage has 7 subdivisions. And so there would be a kind of master or logos, a kind of a Buddha or Christ, you might say, at the head of each of these subdivisions. And it's my sense that Sri Guru Babaji is at the head of one of those 7 subdivisions. The first ray, and that tradition manifests at this time more deeply resonantly through the Hindu tradition. That's the first ray religion in the world. And that the second ray religion is Buddhism. Not exclusively, there's other kinds of teachings in the world that have a predominantly second ray focus. But Buddhism is sort of the outstanding example of that, and the Ma Chohan is the master at the head of that lineage. Now, when you get very advanced into the most sort of esoteric dimensions of any of these traditions, they become so close to the core of the planetary lineage that they become very encompassing. So they start to look a lot like each other and overlap a great deal. But there's still a little bit of a leaning there. So that's at the level where a Sri Guru Babaji or Mahachohan, somebody like that, is very planetary in their vision and the manifestation of the Dharma, but they still express a leaning. Whereas a being like Sanat Kumara is more expressing the unification of all 7 of those lineages. Now, Sanat Kumara in another octave is actually one of 7 also, but that's like a higher, it's sort of like everything's relative, where one being might be the point of synthesis and unification at one level, and another context, they are yet another part of another kind of collective. And then there's a being that is the synthesis of that collective, but in a higher octave, that being is part of another collective, and hence you just have this sort of holarchy of holes within holes within holes. So Sanat Kumara is, yes, a more comprehensive being, but it's also part of a larger order of a larger spiritual order, you might say. So does that help a little more, Lars? Okay, we're getting pretty far out with our esotericism today.
Mark,
Yes, Hans, Christian.
I would like to just add to your truly wonderful teaching this Sunday that Maheshwanath, Sri M's master in this life, he was frequently traveling to Tolingmut Monastery in Western Tibet, which is exactly where also Kuthumi and Moria were hanging out, and some of the Mahatma letters, they were written from that monastery and sent from that monastery. So interesting that they meet up at the same places also, apparently. We don't know. It must be. And also Maheshwanath was, he was kind of like a master, or at least some coach for Laxman Jo of Kashmir Shaivism. So also interesting that they branch in there as well.
Right. Yes, wonderful. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. Yeah, and you might remember in the Mahatma letters where Kuthumi talked about setting off on a journey to visit the Chinese adepts, who I'm sure are the same ones that Yan Xin talked about training with in the mountains of China. And so at some level, I think there's actually quite a, and Blavatsky herself, when she was trained by Moria, was sent all around the world. She was sent to study with Native Americans in Canada, to study with shamans in South America, to obviously to the Middle East to study with Sufis and Coptics and Neoplatonists and Christian mystics, and that's of course throughout India, studying with different kinds of masters. So they obviously knew, Moria obviously knew as her teacher, a wide variety of masters from different traditions all around the world, and sent her to study with these different people. And even within their own tradition, one of the great masters was the Swami Narayan, who I mentioned last week. He was more, on an outer level. What we see with these planetary lineages is a kind of dual identity, you might say, where the master will live in a particular location, and so they'll tend to be adept at outwardly at the local lineages. That's part of how they can interact with the people in that community. And then, so for instance, the Tibetan Moria, Kuthumi, Ma Chohan had a persona that was strongly connected to Tibetan Buddhism. And there's people that would talk about seeing Moria or Kuthumi, for instance, wearing the Lugpa robes and visible in Tibet in that context. One time, though, Colonel Alcott said that he was at the Sikh temple in Amritsar and he saw Kuthumi dressed as a Sikh. So at other times he'd be dressed like a yogi in India. Or Alice Bailey said she saw him in Europe dressed like a European wearing a suit when he visited her. So they just changed their persona depending on the context. And, I think there's even a story in Sri M's book about Maheshwanath, appearing as a Sikh. So it's certainly there's a bit of a leaning, but there's also this profound openness and integration and familiarity with a lot of traditions. And imagine, some of these masters are said to be centuries old. You kind of learn the ropes. You get around, you meet lots of different people. You have so much time on your hands. You learn a lot of different traditions. And we see that perhaps one of the most profound expressions of that in literature that we see from these traditions is in a text like The Secret Doctrine, where Kuthumi and Moria, who were the primary authors of that book with Blavatsky, demonstrated a staggering knowledge of the world traditions. They were quoting from the South American Mayan texts and Taoist texts, and they had a vast familiarity of mythology from Scandinavia or ancient Greek myths and everything. They just seem to have a comprehensive planetary knowledge of the mythologies, the philosophies, the religious traditions, the practices of the entire planet, as far as I could see. So, on the one hand, they may have a little bit of a kind of specialization in different areas of the world, and on the other hand, they're sort of branching out and becoming very eclectic and integrative and multifaceted in their knowledge of the Dharma throughout the world. Wonderful. Well, thank you for sharing. And I'm sure we'll keep bumping back up against this theme as we go.
Yeah.
Let's see. Well, we've been talking about the principle of transformation, which is, to my sense, one of the most key intuitions to develop in order to understand the meaning of the tantric vision and the tantric approach. And there are just many facets to the implications of understanding the tantric vision. But in order to explore another facet that's deeply connected to this vision of Tantra as transformation, a vision of transformation, which is the notion of the interplay of opposites, the sacred marriage of polarities, of Shiva and Shakti, of divine masculine and feminine, for instance, which is, one of the ways of characterizing a kind of a vision of spiritual awakening as a marriage or an integration, a union of opposites. We can see how this works very importantly through the light of this vision of transformation. So to come at that in a broader context, to lay a kind of foundation for that, I'm going to step back for a moment and just speak briefly about the general cosmology that we're working with in this context. So one of the handouts that I sent out yesterday is the one called, it's the definitions one, that kind of gives an overview. Hope people were able to take a quick look at that, or maybe have a printout available, but if not, doesn't matter. I'll be going over it a little bit here verbally, and you can use that as a reference now or later if you wish. The broadest context for a deep understanding of Tantra and related principles like transformation and sacred marriage is a core understanding of the universal realities, perhaps the most essential of which is the distinction between the comprehensive understanding of reality that we call Brahman or the Tao, suchness in Buddhism, or sometimes emptiness, sunyata, Nirguna Brahman particularly. It's a comprehension of reality that is radically non-dual. We've talked about this a bit in other webinars, so I won't go too much into that right now, clarifying that. But we contrast this non-dual expression of reality or nature of reality with a dimension that we can call the relative. Now, it's not as though the relative dimension of reality is different than the non-dual. It's not a different dimension. It's just, it arises in and as an expression of the non-dual. But it's a dimension of reality that in some kind of mysterious way takes up relative points of view. That's the reason that we're calling it the relative, is that it's born out of and expresses partial understandings of the transcendental reality, Brahman, the Tao. If you are experiencing the fundamental spiritual perception that reality is non-dual, it's Brahman, then you're, in a sense, you've entered into this radically non-dual realization of the non-dual. But if instead you decide, well, I think reality is primarily about love. Love is a profound principle, but it's a relative point of view. Love generally has meaning to us because it's in contrast to something else. Like, for instance, love versus selfishness, or love versus wisdom. And so if we take love to be the true nature of all of reality, we're taking a relative and partial view. And now we've taken this comprehensive reality and we've narrowed it down to something less than what it is in its totality. We're taking a relative point of view and we're creating a kind of smaller reality out of that expansive Tao, universal Brahman. So all of these universes that we know of in our ordinary experience, mind and body, different dimensions, different qualities, elements and objects, bodies and events, time and space, these are all relative truths, relative experiences that make up relativity. That's this sort of whirling pattern of states of consciousness and events and beings and matter and energy and so on. All manifestations of relativity. They are born out of partial understandings of reality. So we call that whole vast, mysterious, extremely complex and rich reality relativity. And within relativity, there's two fundamental conditions one can be in. One can either buy into the relativity and break up reality into parts and perceive separation and distinction where there actually isn't any. Or one can be present to all the relativity, all these distinctions, beings and planes and worlds and universes, and at the same time see that it's all fundamentally Buddha nature. It's all Brahman, it's all the Tao. So if you're able to see that, if you realize that, you've attained a state called God consciousness or self-realization or liberation or nirvana, non-dual realization. And so to keep it simple, we'll just call that nirvana. It's the realization of the true nature of how things are, even though it appears to be all this complex diversity of separate things or energies or states or processes and so on. So there's the perception of the diversity of relativity. And if you buy into that, that's what the Buddhists and Hindus sometimes call samsara. That leads to a sense of separation, a misunderstanding of reality that leads to friction and dissociation and alienation and suffering and disease, fragmentation, confusion. So that's another distinction, samsara and nirvana. They both take place within relativity because the non-dual in its fundamental nature has no need to wake up. It's eternally what it is. It's only beings within samsara and relativity that are confused and therefore can be in a state of confusion, or they can be in a state of understanding the truth, nirvana, self-realization. So we have the absolute and the relative, and within the relative we have two possibilities: ignorance and suffering, or awakening and truth. course, without, throughout the different traditions of the world, there are many different terms and ways of understanding what this state of awakening is. We could call it Christ consciousness. We could call it theosis, jivan mukti, or which means liberated while living. Because you don't have to leave relativity. You don't have to somehow. It's not like the non-dualist somewhere else. This is it. It's right. It is our very nature. It's the reality that we're immersed in. It's just our understanding of what it is. That's the problem. So we don't have to go anywhere to have self-realization. We can have that right here in relationship to our own ordinary experience. So nirvana, or self-realization, is something that is fully compatible with being right here, right now. It doesn't have to take place in some other realm or so on. So these worlds that we've heard of, the astral plane, the mental plane, and increasingly subtle worlds, are not necessarily an expression of like a path to go back home again, as if liberation is at the top of a hierarchy of worlds or something. That's, in my experience, that is not the nature of why there are these different realities. Non-dual realization, awakening, can happen right here, and in relationship to everything that we're ordinarily experiencing. Okay, so that's kind of the basic context, and in that context we can begin to look at what is the primordial male and female then? Well, as relativity comes into being, one of the most basic polarities that we experience is consciousness, or the observer, the witness, an ability, that aspect of our experience, that's simply that dimension of our nature that is aware and kind of it looks out at the world and says, okay, there's something going on here. And then there is that which is perceived. So there's an observer and an observed. Myself as consciousness, and then stuff outside of me that doesn't appear to be like when I have my coffee, or that's actually a tea mug here. This just seems like, matter, and it's separate from me if I am thinking of myself as, just some kind of being that's aware and is looking at it, or experiencing it, touching it. So there's phenomena, there's sights and sound. We contact, in the physical world, we contact other through our senses. We see things, we hear things, we taste things, we smell things. We have sensory contact with phenomena out there. So that kind of gives rise to this very basic element to human experience, and I think this is at the heart of all sentient beings at some form of this or another, is the kind of self and other, consciousness and that which we're conscious of, the knower and the known. Now, in the state of ignorance, we perceive that those two realities as fundamentally different than each other. They're separate. There's me and there's the stuff. The stuff's coming and going. One day, in this moment I'm in my car, the next moment, that's what's the otherness, is carness. Next moment I'm in the house making dinner. It keeps changing what's in front of me, what's around me, what I'm hearing, seeing, smelling, tasting, feeling. So there's a sensation that there's some kind of a stability to my observer, and then the other stuff is constantly in flux. So that can't be quite as real. There must be something more real about this. So one of the ways of kind of categorizing this distinction is either self and world, or even more intimately, mind and body. because we can even close our eyes, and in the meditative context, we can shift into a position where even our body and our senses become that which is observed, rather than the world out there. Like, instead of saying my boundary is my skin and my senses are the way I contact what's out there, you could take another step back and say, even my body is not me. My body is something I can observe. It comes and goes. I'm a pure mind consciousness being, witnessing even my body or my emotions or even my thoughts. Even my thoughts are coming and going. And I have a pure kind of awareness that can step back even from my thoughts. And now my thoughts are part of this phenomena that I'm not, and that's coming and going. So what falls into that category of other can go all the way to a level of that it's just anything I can step back from and observe, even thoughts, even internal states, even emotions, things that I imagine, even intuitions. So this gives rise to a very fundamental part of human experience of reality being able to be experienced as essentially some kind of self, which often in its purest form seems like it's related very much to consciousness, because we can become an objective observer and step back into a kind of pure witness, and then the other, the world around us, objects and beings and energies, even subtle states, subtle dimensions, vibrations, kundalini, psychic experiences, all that's other also, this stuff coming and going that we're witnessing. And if we experience that distinction of self and other as in a so-called deluded state, the ignorant state, the state of ordinary sentient beings in samsara, which is pretty much us and everything that we see around us. A basic element of what causes it to be a state of discontent, of suffering, is this perception of the distinction between me as the observer and the world around me and phenomena, even my bodies, as separate from each other. So awakening, the non-dual state, is discovering a reality that's more fundamental than that distinction, where we can see that both the witness and what is witnessed are actually part of a more fundamental reality and are ultimately not separate. So from a transformational point of view, and this is where Tantra comes in, from a traditional point of view, let's say a path of renouncing, we could say, well, if nirvana, if God consciousness is transcending that dualism, I should just let go of believing I'm either mind or body, either the consciousness or that which is I'm conscious of. There must be something more profound, more mysterious, more transcendental, that is the very substance out of which all of that is made. So that would be more like the path of letting it go, of negation. I'm not my thoughts, I'm not my consciousness, I'm not my senses, I'm not my body, I'm not any objects, I'm not my car. Somebody scratches my car, I don't have to freak out. So I'm not my car. Car can get stolen, get damaged. I'm okay. Everything, we even identify with things like our cars and our houses and our jobs and all these things. But as we peel all that away, one of the paths to that is letting it all go. I'm not this, I'm not that. But in the tantric approach, we could say, well, what if we were to transform the experience of self and other, of observer and observed? What becomes our experience of the nature of our mind and body, for instance? If instead of just letting them go, we kind of awaken within them an illuminated version of them that still kind of expresses the essence of each, but in a form that realizes its true nature. Is there a form of mind that knows its true nature? So it's still consciousness, but it's illuminated consciousness. Is there a form of body and sense and from experience of the nature of so-called matter and energy in the world that is the illuminated version of that, where in that state we still get to experience this reality of this duality, but it's now in a state where we realize the interconnectedness between the two and the non-dual nature of the two, but in a way that doesn't necessarily sort of like require renouncing them or kind of obliterating them. There's a saying in Zen, at the moment of profound awakening, in that moment, mind and body are dropped. That's kind of a traditional way of talking about it. We have to drop the perception of the dualism of mind and body to have full self-realization. The tantric perspective would say mind and body illuminated, mind and body married, mind and body transformed, reveals the non-dual nature of reality. So in the mailing that I sent out, on the first page of the one called Definitions, I have at the top, there's a little picture, sort of a little diagram. At the top is the absolute. And under that is the Adi Buddha, which we could also call by other terms. We'll come back to that. That's another piece we'll come to in a moment. And under that are Shiva and Shakti, and under that are mind and body. And what I was hoping to sort of illustrate by this is that embedded in the experience of relative samsaric dualism is the basic distinction of mind and body. And that's a very rich and profound subject. So we're actually going to come back to that because there's more and more to explore about what that actually means. But we've talked about it a little bit, so we'll just work with that at the moment and say, there's this basic reality of self and other, mind and body. And then there's the truth of the non-duality of all of that. So we'll sort of visualize that as they're not really separate, but we'll kind of visualize them as like, there's the non-dual ground of being, and then there's the level at which they appear as separate phenomena. And kind of in between them, if we visualize it as like a chart, a diagram, in between them is the illuminated version of each. Like the illuminated version of body is Shakti, and the illuminated version of mind is Shiva. Illuminated mind would be, for instance, the state of consciousness in which we perceive the non-dual nature of reality. It's called in Dzogchen Rigpa, which means like true knowledge, clarity, seeing the truth, wisdom. But there's a corresponding version of that, which is if the mind can be transformed into a pure nature in which it's experiencing non-dual realization, also body or phenomena or the sort of energetic nature of reality has an illuminated version too. In the Hindu tantric and hatha yoga traditions, for instance, in India, it's called Shakti or Kundalini. The personal version is Kundalini, the universal version is Shakti. And it has various interpretations. The way I'm using it here is to mean the awakened version, the perception of the essence of phenomena as not ultimately separate from consciousness and not ultimately separate from its own non-dual ground or nature. It's the awakened version of energy. So there's a samsaric version of energy or body and matter, and an awakened version. So in this way of understanding spiritual development, it's not necessary to negate or turn our attention away from the basic phenomena of life, mind and body, consciousness and form and energy. We can transform our experience of them. And in fact, the very nature of their, within relativity, the very nature of mind and body, of consciousness and energy, become illuminated, become transformed. And in that transformed state, we realize their profound interconnectedness. They marry. On one level, we can think of it as something that we're kind of creating or making a marriage of the two. We can foster awakening in that way. At another level, it's really just the true nature of how it always is. It's just a matter of perceiving it that way. So from another point of view, we can think of it as more like a discovery and something we uncover, truth that is revealed. That always was. But from a kind of relative point of view of time and growth and transformation, there also is a level at which we will experience our minds and body going through a change in order to experience that realization of their true nature. Let's see what time it is here. Okay. So there's certainly more to say about all that to kind of flesh that out. But I'm going to pause for now, see if there's any, we're going to take a break soon, just see if there's any questions about what we've gone over so far.
Well, if nobody else has, then I...
Go ahead. Yes, please.
It gets tricky when we talk about these two polarities. Then if we start talking about the Trinity at the same time, like let's say, if we say, for example, the concept of Satchidananda. So in your description, is Satchidananda like a part of the relativity? Is the non-dual the absolute beyond Satchidananda? Because often in maybe some other traditions, Satchidananda is supposed to be your truth, the truth. And then maybe you can comment on that, but then there we could see Satchidananda. Chit would be the consciousness principle you talk about, and Ananda, energy. But then there is also Sat, which would be like being, pure awareness. So would that being be a part of the relative existence of polarities of Shiva and Shakti? Or would that being describe somehow the core? Because for me, I have been very much intuiting and very much this has played a big role in my own practice, is this being, consciousness and energy in how I investigate. So why do you put the being, the be or being in your concept of Shiva and Shakti, consciousness and energy?
Okay, thank you. As a bit of context for my response, let me just say that a lot of these different concepts do have different interpretations. For instance, if we go to a tradition like Buddhism, which especially beginning with Mahayana Buddhism, there is a pervasive concept of sunyata, or emptiness as a way of talking about a more fundamental understanding of reality or a type of truth. But then when we look more closely at the Buddhist tradition, we find there's different schools, different interpretations. So even if there's agreement about this notion of sunyata, then there's different camps, different traditions, different philosophers. So for instance, in the Yogacara school, they interpret it one way, and then in the Madhyamaka school, they interpret it another way. So part of what we run into, that's just a Buddhist example. Certainly in Hinduism, same thing. We find different people interpreting these things. So some people, for instance, would say the Atman is not different then, it's just a different way of talking about Brahman, but really you don't have an Atman and I have an Atman. There's just Atman, which is Brahman, there's no difference. Whereas somebody else would say, no, the Atman is sort of an individualized form of your own nature that realizes Brahman. So in one sense it is Brahman, because everything is Brahman, but from another angle, it's your individual realization of it. The part of the reason that one person can be awake and another not is because one person has Atmic realization and the other doesn't. So their Atmans must be different if one has this and the other doesn't. So different interpretations, you see. So it gets a little complicated and challenging sometimes just kind of generally reading in these different traditions, because sometimes they're using the same terms and they don't mean the same thing when they say these things. So that's a little bit of a preface by way of saying, this is my interpretation of something like Satchidananda. It's not necessarily what somebody else would say. Some people might, other people might not. To put it in a kind of Buddhist, a Hindu context, I would lean towards the point of view of saying that reality in its fundamental nature is best described as nirguna. Like nirguna Brahman is the fundamental truth. And nirguna, of course, is a Sanskrit word that means roughly without qualities, meaning nir is not, without, and guna are characteristics or traits or qualities. So nirguna Brahman means such a comprehensive fundamental reality that you can't find words or concepts or qualities or principles to designate its nature, because as soon as you do, you're back into relativity. You're saying it's this and not that. So for instance, if we were to say that it's bliss, ananda, that one of the characteristics of Brahman is ananda, then how does that account for the suffering that's in the universe? Is the suffering not part of Brahman in some way? Brahman is radically non-dual. It must include the suffering. So to me, ananda is a symptom of realizing Brahman. It's one of the traits that expresses or is natural to the experience of realizing that all is Brahman, all is God, all is the Tao. But it's not a characteristic that defines Brahman. Brahman is nirguna. It's beyond even the bliss. It's not to say that it doesn't have bliss, but it also contains samsara as well. All is within Brahman, both nirvana and samsara. So Satchidananda is a way of defining nirvana. That's what you experience in nirvana. But samsara is also part of Brahman too. So Brahman can't be Satchidananda except that it's contained within it as a reality. Satchidananda to me is the experience of the quality of beingness and consciousness and liberated bliss, freedom from suffering that comes from understanding the truth of reality, intuitively grasping Brahman. So that's, I think, addressing part of your question. Part of it too was about sat or beingness. What is that in this context? that's a little more open to an even broader kind of, freedom of interpretation. To me, one way to kind of go with that, it's interesting, Daskalos's Trinity is absolute beingness, Christ Logos as consciousness, and Holy Spirit as energy, the creative principle. That's pretty similar to Shiva and Shakti, Christ Logos and Holy Spirit. And then there's absolute beingness, which is interesting, is using that word being to kind of distinguish it from the other two. He says it contains both, though. These two aren't, it's not like a trinity where this is separate from those two, but rather this is the unifying truth, and the other two are the sort of the arms of, absolute beingness. I find that an appealing way to go. I don't agree with Daskalos's creator deity version of absolute beingness, but the beingness part of it as sort of like that's one of the reasons I like the word presence, is it's kind of a beingness quality. And for me, it's unifying in the sense that it has both Shiva and Shakti within it. But that's just my particular style of interpreting Sat. It doesn't have to be understood that way, and I'm sure people give it other meanings. But for me, it's like there are these basic elements of our ordinary experience. For instance, there is the experience of being a knower. Then there's the experience of, say, phenomena and energy of sensory experiences, or even just energetic experiences of the body, feeling our breath moving. It's a simple sensation in life of being able to experience feelings, sensory experiences, movement. And so an essential component, a way to boil that down, is it's sort of like it's energy, it's phenomena. So there's consciousness, knowing. There's also phenomena, which is sort of mind and matter, bodies and phenomena. But another basic element of our experience is just the fact that we exist. And so that's, I think, where the beingness element comes from. It's the saying, well, there's the fact that we exist, there's the fact that we're conscious, and there's the fact that there is feeling, energetic phenomena. The essence of that phenomena we can talk about in different ways. We can call it Shakti, we can call it love, we can call it Prakriti or nature, we can call it Ananda or bliss, because that kind of carries more of that feeling quality, and it's the way, one of the ways that feeling manifests when we're awakened, is that life becomes blissful. I don't think it's a comprehensive description, though, of Shakti, just to say it's bliss. Shakti's more comprehensive than that, but it's definitely a part of it. In some ways, I think that you could say that the beingness quality is just sort of like a dimension of just kind of pointing to reality. It's like existence. And in that sense, I don't think we should say that beingness goes more to consciousness than to Shakti or energy. Both are saturated with true being. So in that sense, that can be a more, but in that trinity, I think it's useful to not collapse them into one. We can say that beingness is a quality, consciousness as a principle, Shakti as a principle. But it's sort of like beingness kind of is moving us in the direction of pointing towards Brahman. It's like the ultimate reality, true being, ultimate nature of things. So I like that Trimurti of, Satchidananda. I don't tend to emphasize it as much, though, because I prefer to say there is Brahman and then Shiva and Shakti. If we were to add a third principle into that, I would call it something like the Adi Buddha. And then Adi Buddha is not something different than Shiva and Shakti. It's essentially the realization of the union of Shiva and Shakti. It's the state of a perfect, balanced appreciation of the radical inseparability of Shiva and Shakti. So it's kind of like the heart of the state of non-dual realization and beingness in its completeness, not just as an understanding or as an illuminate, a liberated energy, but their fusion is represented by the Adi Buddha, the primordial Buddha, or Christ consciousness, or there's other words for that too. So, Lena, how are we doing with that? Are we?
Thank you. I think we have to leave it for now. But in your scheme, then you would put this absolute beingness more like that consists both Shiva and Shakti, so more in that level of Adi Buddha. Whereas then Daskalos would use this Christ Logos as a Shiva principle, and then Holy Spirit as a Shakti principle. So also there your definition is different, but it doesn't matter, you don't have to go. I know that there's time for other topics also, but but it has started a bit esoteric this evening. So
if we're gonna get into sort of comparing them more, I brought up Daskalos as a reference, but definitely gets pretty complicated comparing systems too, because you have what I'm saying, for instance, is my vision, and then there's trying to say, well, how does Adi Buddha relate to absolute beingness in Daskalos' system, or Shiva to Christ Logos, or it's fascinating. And it's a good way to kind of hone in, clarifying what it is, and it's important in some ways because it's easy to sometimes slip into saying, oh, they're all saying the same thing, and then, kind of lump them all together. And that can become a problem because when we're encountering different teachings, if they're not saying exactly the same thing, we're kind of muddling it together, and it kind of dilutes our understanding. So it's important, and I don't mind talking about it, but it is it's a big process too. So that we bit off a chunk. So as you said, that's good for now. And thanks for that question. And let me check the time. Okay, it's 11:38. It's a good time for a break. I see that Linda has a question, so I'm going to ask you to hold that till after we come back, Linda, and I'll be happy to take your questions then. We're going to talk particularly more about Shiva and Shakti and Adi Buddha when we come back as well. So that topic will continue. So let's take our 10-minute break, and then we'll have a meditation, and then we'll continue with our talk. Okay. I see a couple of questions have also popped up during the break, and so we'll jump into those soon, but let's just take a moment now to have a meditation. So let's go within now. Just become more present. Letting your mind and body relax. And move your attention now to your feet. And pay attention to the sensations in your toes, in your feet, your ankles, your awareness is your Shiva, essence of mind, consciousness. And the sensations are energy, phenomena. Just be mindful of how your feet feel. And now visualize white light surrounding and suffusing your feet. The white light is energy. Try to sense the energy of the luminosity. Moving your awareness now up into your lower legs, up to your knees, from your feet to your knees. Feel your whole lower legs and feet. And surrounding and suffusing your lower legs with white light. If you can't see the light very clearly, just hold the thought that it's there. Know that your legs are surrounded by light. And now move your awareness to your upper legs, from your knees to your hips, sensing that part of your body. And see this region of your body, from your knees to your hips, surrounded and permeated with white light. So now your hips to your feet are bathed, surrounded by nurturing, healing, energizing white light. Now move your awareness up into your lower body, or from your hips on up into your chest. Especially feeling the region from your hips to your solar plexus. Feel yourself connected to this part of your body. Incarnate. Feel your awareness and sensitivity. Spread throughout this area of your body, from your solar plexus down to your feet. And see this region from your hips to your solar plexus also bathed in white light. And now visualize a sphere of light surrounding your solar plexus, about 2/3 of a meter in diameter. 2.5 feet in diameter. A sky blue, light blue light, radiant, peaceful. Surrounding and permeating your body with your solar plexus in the center. This light is energizing and nurturing to your physical body. It also has the power to transform, to raise the vibration of your physical body. From the solar plexus, this energy permeates your body, transforming, lifting the vibration of your physical body and its etheric energy. Now move your awareness up into your chest, feeling the region from your solar plexus to your shoulders. And see your heart as the center of a sphere of rose-colored white light, a light rose color. A little bit smaller than the previous sphere, about 1/2 a meter in diameter. This light brings peace and contentment to your emotional body. But it's also filled with love and a transformative energy that heals and transforms your emotional body. See this rose-colored light surrounding your heart. Know that it transforms emotions into peace and compassion, contentment. Now move your awareness up into your shoulders and down your arms to your hands. Feeling clearly your body in this region. And see your arms and hands surrounded and permeated by white light. And now moving your awareness up through your neck into your head. Visualize your head surrounded by a sphere of luminous yellow light, a golden yellow light. This sphere a little smaller than the other two, but surrounding and permeating your head. This sphere transforms your mental body, bringing clarity and wisdom. See your whole body surrounded and permeated by white light. And the three spheres of light centered in the solar plexus, the blue white light, the rose white light surrounding the heart, and the golden yellow light surrounding the head. All calming, illuminating, healing, and transforming your personality, your mind, emotions, and physical body. And when you feel ready, open your eyes. So we've been delving into some pretty philosophical areas today. I wanted to take a minute to share a little why I personally feel drawn to clarify some of these issues, even at a kind of more philosophical level. A key part of that, for me, on a personal level, in a sense, in terms of my personal work or dharma in life, is that I feel particularly sensitive to a need, among other things, in terms of a transformation of the dharma that's happening in the world today, to explore the subtle ways that there are imbalances in our approach to spirituality. And in fact, one of the ways I feel that this imbalance sort of creeps in and has permeated various forms of the Dharma throughout history could be looked at from the point of view of gender imbalances. That there are from all levels, from kind of overt, concrete social levels in terms of the way genders are treated within given spiritual traditions, to different styles of practice that can lean one way or the other, to psychological and philosophical understandings that actually can take the form of overtly or more subtly actually taking a form of gender imbalance. For instance, in the context of Shiva and Shakti that we've been talking about, there's a concept in Hinduism and certainly in other traditions, but to use the Shiva and Shakti imagery of, we can look at our nature and the world around us as having these fundamental principles that make up the core of relativity and reflect in the world around us and in ourselves. And how do we relate to them? For instance, if we cultivate a spiritual path that emphasizes masculine traits, in a sense, that's a type of gender imbalance. And we may not think of it in those terms. We may use other words. We may say something like, consciousness is the ultimate reality. To me, that's a subtle form of gender imbalance, because consciousness is the Shiva principle. It doesn't represent all of reality. It's part of a fundamental polarity of Shiva and Shakti, or mind and body, consciousness and energy. And so if our practice leans that way, or if our philosophy leans that way, I feel that there's an imbalance there, and then that imbalance plays out in other areas as well. It'll subconsciously or consciously influence us to approach the path in a certain way, or to embrace a certain lifestyle, etc. So that's part of the reason that I get kind of particular about these philosophical issues, is to me they are not just kind of issues of preference. They're fundamentally a question of, what is the deepest way that we can understand these things? And a key element of that issue is that we have a sort of pervasive challenge in humanity at this time of gender imbalance, and one of the basic places that shows up is in our spiritual traditions. So I feel like it needs to be rooted out. It needs to be examined and faced and illuminated, and in a way that transforms it and gives birth to a clearer, more balanced approach to the Dharma. And part of how that works, I think there was a question last time maybe asking about my process around that, maybe my relation, because we're getting into a sacred marriage. And so I think I took that question to mean something a little bit about how does that work for Karen and I. And of course, that's a big question. A little bit of that's been touched on in my autobiography so far, but kind of address this issue in that, bring that into this context. Part of my exploration is simply my life, my spiritual practice. As I was saying earlier, things just, as intuition develops, things just come to light. And so it's kind of a organic exploration of these issues. And it just sort of, happens that these things are, part of my experience. They're just in my nature. I can't not be with them, you might say. But also, certainly a part of it is being in a relationship with my wife, Karen. Our relationship is a fundamentally, significant part of my path. It creates a context for my own individual process, because our own awakening is deeply interconnected. And that manifests in a variety of different ways. On an energetic level, that's something that we're not even necessarily aware of, but there's a constant sort of relationship there that's stimulating to both of us and stimulates our mutual awakening. And also a kind of ordinary level of human relationship where we live together, we explore the path together. And a part of that is also a simple dialogue. Karen and I are constantly in dialogue about all these things. And this gender balance thing is also something that, of course, Karen is very sensitive to. So that's an underlying theme. We're not always focusing on that, of course, but it's there. I think Karen feels sensitive, maybe even from past lives, to feeling in touch with the sort of shadow side of traditions that results from gender imbalances and being sort of a spokesperson for that. So part of my practice to be very sensitive to that and listen to that and integrate that. There's in the Hindu tradition, in the tantric lineages, there's a sort of way that a lot of the tantric scriptures or treatises are often conveyed as a dialogue between Shiva and Shakti. So it's like a conversation. And there's three kinds. One are sort of like Shiva tantras, because Shiva is kind of in the teacher role and Shakti is like a student. And Shakti is asking questions and Shiva's answering. But there's other kinds of tantras where Shakti is the teacher and Shiva's in the student role. And so Shiva's asking questions and Shakti is answering. And then there's a third kind of tantra where they're more like peers and they're just having a dialogue and evoking, insight in each other more mutually. And it's kind of that third archetype that is the way Karen and I relate, whereas there's just a constant dialogue, an exchange of Shiva and Shakti. We sort of feel like, in a sense, we represent each human being is both, but of course, on a relative level, people have their leanings. So in a certain sense, I'm a little more Shiva leaning, Karen's a more Shakti leaning, and we are engaged in a kind of dialogue, both energetically, living together, but also verbally. So there's a constant sort of mutual investigation of the Dharma in that way. So that's a style. I'm not saying that the only way to be on a tantric path is to have a partner and engage. Tantra is very much about ultimately the internal union in one's own realization of these basic principles of the sacred masculine and feminine. And that the external is simply a mirror and a support of that, if that's part of one's dharma. For a lot of people, it's not in any given incarnation or during periods of any incarnation. So it's not at all a necessary part to have that external version. Happens to be that that's the case for Karen and I. But it's not at all required in that sense. So that's a little bit more about, I hope that's an answer to a question I remember hearing, I think last week, about sharing a little bit more about our process together. Now I saw before the break, I think starting with Linda, Oops. There we go. Linda said, can I ask a question? So let me shift over to unmuting and see if Linda wants to share her question.
Yes. It was about you commenting and talking about the different names that's been given to mind and consciousness, emptiness, so on. And then you said, and correct me if I'm wrong or confirm, that you sort of leaned into a more maybe new words around it, and you call it presence and existence, you said. And I kind of, maybe if that was the case that you said that, I kind of resonated with it and was thinking about sort of a ground of existence of everything. You know, you can call it what you want in order of what kind of trait you have or culture you come from or lineage, but is it so that you could sort of realize the ground of existence or the ground of, or the some sort of essence in every phenomena, in every arising emotion, in every thought, and if it's so, it's like a question within a question, and and if it's so, you are not able actually to renounce anything at all, actually, because where does it have to go, and if it transforms, you know, why and to what? And I was thinking about in that we learn to make distinguish a difference between soul and maybe our egoic nature before we can approach a more tantric path. And would you then say that you could go to this ground of existence or essence of existence in your egoic nature? So that's a lot of questions.
Okay.
You understand what I'm saying?
I think so. You can. I'll jump in, and you can tell me if I'm on the right track.
Just unmute this one. Mute this one.
Yeah, I think there's a way in which, for a lot of people, it's tempting to kind of categorize the ground of being, the deepest reality, the Tao or Brahman, as just kind of being. It's primordial being. And so there's like a quality where, you know, from a tantric point of view, you might say, well, you know, separate self is a problem, so we have to get to know self. We have to negate the self. It's a path of negation, letting go, peeling away something. And there's a relative truth to that, because all of these things are kind of, the path itself is a relative process of addressing this need for awakening. But the closer we get to the radical truth of reality, the more we have to release these relative ideas and practices and open to just reality, which can't be negated or affirmed or transformed or any of these things. It's something more mysterious than that. But it's kind of like we're deep in a labyrinth in samsara, where we're not able to directly contemplate that reality yet. We're sort of, there's layers in between not that reality, because all the layers themselves are that reality, but there's layers between our realization of it. It's like our consciousness is trying to look at something and there's veils. So to work with the next veil, because it's several veils away, there might be more dualism in how we think about that. I have to purify this. I have to remove this. I have to renounce it. And that's valid at that level, because we're deep in the the labyrinth. And so we kind of have to work with the way we're currently experiencing it. So that's how it works. But as we get closer to a deeper perception of things, our style of understanding what's happening changes. It becomes more non-dual. It's maybe not fully non-dual yet, but it's less dualistic. And so that's when we talk about moving from a traditional to a tantric view. It's more illuminated, it's more subtle, it's more infused with non-dualism. And as that brings us even closer to the truth, we can open up to something that's even beyond transformation, beyond marriage, beyond those kind of archetypes and intuitions about reality. And it's about simply awakening to the truth of how it is and always was. But we can't do that last step if we're deep in the labyrinth. In fact, any attempt to do it is actually going to reflect that we're deep in the labyrinth, so we'll still be tainted with that dualism, and even the way we think about it will be kind of, primitive compared to the truth of real non-dual contemplation or realization. So I think it's useful to just accept what level of the labyrinth am I in? What way can I work that's practical and kind of honors the truth of what I'm experiencing, even though it's not the highest way I can imagine that it actually is, but here I am, this is what I'm experiencing, so I'll work with the principles that are appropriate to that level, and then that'll more efficiently get me closer to it, to the truth, to seeing that reality. And as we get to that, we realize it isn't any different than where we always were. It's our understanding that was veiled, and by mutually reflection, our energy will reflect that. The way we experience energy will be veiled as well. And beingness is one of those realities that transforms. At this level, we're in touch with this basic sense of existing and of I-ness, of being. I am. Here I am. And we could focus on renouncing that, but we can also transform that sense of being. Take up that thread and attune to it and go deeper into it, so that instead of peeling it away, we're going into a deeper truth of it. And then, words like presence and self-realization, Satchidananda, Sat being start to have deeper meaning for us and resonate with this path of awakening to deeper beingness. Ultimately, we realize that the radical ultimate beingness is the interconnectedness of all life, the Tao, Brahman. So it's in a sense that beingness or existence or even self can be a path to self-realization, as opposed to simply seen as an obstacle, which is kind of a more traditional way of doing it. So how am I doing, Linda? Am I touching it?
Yeah, I think you answered. I like your answer. I think it was
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so next was Tamara. Tamara asked, I'm curious about the three aspects of nature of mind in the Buddhist tradition: empty, cognizant, and luminous. I'm thinking of that the empty state is Nirguna Brahman. So yeah, to start with, yes, to put it in sort of Buddhist terminologies, emptiness or suchness or the base is the ground, is Nirguna Brahman. And then cognizance in the mind is Shiva. Yes, another name for that in Dzogchen is like nature of mind or clarity, awareness, primordial awareness is Rigpa, is Shiva. And then luminosity is one of the forms of, there's a saying in Dzogchen, sound, light, and rays, or we can even just substitute a little bit as a synonym, sound, luminosity, and rays. Rays kind of connotes more like, that gets into the Buddha families and the elements and their corresponding luminosities. Sound is kind of more like the nada and radiance. So these are basically all energetic. Whenever we talk about something that ultimately is traceable back to the senses, that's one of the keys that we're actually talking about Shakti. So vision sees light, so if it's luminosity, that's carrying kind of a Shakti energy about it. If it's the sound current, that's a auditory Shakti. If we're talking about vibrations that we feel, Shakti, you know. So anything that is sort of vibration and sensory, even if it's subtle, even if it's very intuitive, it's still part of the sort of Shakti side of energy and phenomena. So does that make sense, Tamara?
Yeah, it does. I was just thinking about it in relation to that other question that the Trinity, Satchitananda, and it also, interestingly, I think there might be a tendency towards a more Shiva leaning in the way that this is taught. I've always been curious because one of the pointing out instructions is to turn your awareness or cognizance on emptiness. So if one is able to turn their awareness on emptiness, then you awaken to nature of mind. But they don't mention luminosity in that process. It's like that whole energetic element just gets dropped out of the picture. Although they'll always say that those are three aspects of nature of mind, and you know, so that always confused me, and so I've been thinking about that. And since you've been talking about it, one of the other ways that I've been taught this is that there's emptiness awareness and unboundedness, and unboundedness would sort of be another way of getting at that energy, which they also say is compassion, like unbounded compassion. So that's also sort of that energetic field. But it's known that all those aspects are not separate from each other, that there's a way in which they're interdependent, and that it's a non-dual situation.
Absolutely. Yeah, I would agree with you. It's a very non-dual teaching, but it probably kind of comes out a little bit more from the Shiva side, where you first open to non-dual clarity, and then that's integrated with energy, with luminosity. Like for instance, in Togel, you awaken luminosity, and then you integrate the state of presence or clarity with the luminosity. And then that even leads to the transformation of the body in the rainbow body. So you have to go back to Shakti, integrate the non-dual presence with it, and then the whole personality and body are transformed.
That is something that I have not been exposed to, the teachings on Toga. So,
in those teachings, there's a lot of emphasis on what are called the three energies, which are basically Shaktis. And they're all the same energy, but it's like looked at in different angles. And I forget some of the Tibetan terms, but I think Rolpa is one of them, for instance. And so in that way, very essentially, some of the terminology is the base, which is emptiness or non-dualism, or the ground, Brahman, or Guna Brahman. Then clarity, which is, awakened awareness, Rikta, and then energy. So that it's very intimately connected to this trinity that I'm describing of Brahman or the Tao, Shiva, and Shakti. It's very similar in Zoga. But like you said, it's kind of a leaning towards go to the Rikta, awaken awareness of the ground, and then integrate it with energy. Whereas, let's say, for instance, by contrast, when we're meditating on the sound current, then you're not focusing on awakening clarity as the doorway. You're listening to illumined energy. And then by tuning to that, wisdom and clarity will come out of that. So it's kind of going the other way. There's lots of other examples, but that would be. So when I was initiated, for instance, into the Sikh lineage, the broader description of that path is it's the path of inner light and sound. So it's the path of luminosity and, kind of awakened sound. In fact, they often call the sound current, the luminous sound, or the sound of radiance, or terms like that. So it's very energy oriented. And then through the back door, you come to wisdom and clarity through attuning to luminosity and sound. It's because ultimately, the non-dual truth and tantric truth is that these two realities are completely interrelated. You cannot actually have a fully matured appreciation for non-dualism without completely integrating with energy. And vice versa. You can't do a Shakti path and not have it really, truly, eventually completely balanced with Shiva. So you may start with one or the other, but it will have to come around full, if it comes to full maturity as a non-dual path, it will completely integrate with the other.
That makes sense to me too, in terms of my own experience, and that in the first few years of practice, I had a lot of Shakti going on. At the same time, a lot of confusion. It wasn't exactly illuminating, it was just energy. There was something opening, but I didn't understand what the heck was going on. So it's
that makes sense.
Yeah, interesting that you say that.
Very good. Okay, thank you.
Can I ask a question about the practice that you taught last week? I've been doing that practice and sitting with it, and also really contemplating the discussion that came out of it about the two accumulations, and thinking about the purifying of karma, and as the accumulation of merit, but also really realizing that there's just like all the levels of habit and patterns of thought and so forth and so on, definitely in my experience are blocking my progress, so to speak, on the path. And so I'm really sort of struck by doing a practice that sort of dissolves or transforms or purifies that aspect of my personality. And when I was doing the practice, I was aware that it felt a lot like the practice in Nundro of Vajrasattva, very much like a purification practice. But I've never been able to really do that practice. I've had an awful lot of resistance to it. And I think the way that you're presenting this as a sort of a healing, transforming, rather than like a flushing out, like Vajrasattva, you're just taking this energy in and throwing out, and it's like you reject, you're washing this stuff out. It's like you're getting rid of stuff. So there's something very, maybe this feels a little more whole or something, more integrated, more balanced, more tantric, even though I know that Vajrasattva is a tantric practice. I don't know, does any of this make sense to you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say, although Vajrasattva is part of it, an overall tantric tradition, Tibetan Buddhism, it's still probably more kind of on the traditional end of purification, sort of like the basic principle of the traditional method, so to speak, is you build up merit by affirming it. Like if you do something like a mantra or a metta, a prayer, a blessing, good work, service, helping others, it's building up merit. And then you want to purify demerit, the impurities in your system from negative karma, you kind of release, you let go of. You at least you don't necessarily want to think in terms of condemning or judging, but you are kind of focusing more on kind of flushing it out or neutralizing it or purifying it. Those kind of terms, letting go. Those are kind of more traditional, what you do with the karma that you want to kind of purify out. So you build up the positive, release the negative, like affirming and negating. And we want to get mature in our style of negating, but it's still going to be tainted with a letting go kind of perspective and philosophy. And so when we move to a more tantric perspective, we engage this notion that those energies can be included. So when we use words like transmutation, healing, transformation, integration, they kind of carry a more tantric spirit. And both have their place, but I think that they're, in some ways, it's very healing to shift to a tantric perspective as soon as we're right to, because it has that more inclusive kind of flavor. In a sense, it's more compassionate towards the energies that need to be worked with in some way. That they might be challenging energies, but we can still include them. And that's more conducive to a spirit of service and bodhisattva too, because similarly, we don't want to just renounce the world and purify ourselves of what's outside of it. We want to be engaged with the world too, so we have to think in the transformational spirit rather than purifying.
Reuse, recycle rather than throw away.
Yeah. Yeah, very good. Okay, thank you. And then Hans Christian had a question.
Yes.
Yeah.
This is wonderful. I was wondering about, you talked earlier about love as a quality, but you talked about it as kind of like part of the dualism, a quality like so many other qualities. But what we are practicing and what is actually central to our practice is, let's say, the outcome, the outcome of merging Shiva and Shakti. So the love making, so to speak, between Shiva and Shakti is that aspect of that love making is love. But it's not love in the human form. It's love, like I usually say, it's what binds everything together. That love, that universal love, is what binds everything together. So without love, there would be a manifest universe. So these the like, also I remember from was it Bailey? I think. What was that thick book called now? I forgot it. Cosmic Fire. Yeah, where she says no, it was Blavatsky. She said there was never two. There was always three. So when the manifestation begins, there was never two. There was never one and then two and then three. There was always three. And so I see that middle aspect, or you can also, the Hindu Trinity, you call it the preserver, Vishnu, which is kind of this love aspect, which is the nurturing, the preserving, and that which brings the extremes together into a wholeness. And also in terms of love, where this love then become, I think, humanized in a tantric practice, we work, and we have been blessed with your teachings from Daskalos about elementals. That the love that we should find in ourselves, the love we should cultivate in ourselves, is that love, that universal love that is going to bring all these little lives back into the wholeness, so that we are not excluding anything. And exactly like Tamra said about her Vajrayana practice, that she feels a little bit like they're trying to push things away, where I feel like the love is actually supposed to take everything in, so that we include everything. I wonder what you, because I feel like you could address that thing about the love having a quality on its own, or you set it aside as a quality like many other qualities.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for the sharing in general and the questions. And there's at least a few in there that I want to touch into. One, I just want to connect to something that you referred to, Tamra's practice. That particular practice, the Vajrasattva, is part of Nundro. And this is a way to kind of get an illustration too of these three views. Generally, Nundro is one of three kind of main stages of practice in Tibetan Buddhism. Nundro, and then a series of tantric practices, and then more radically non-dual practices like Mahamudra or Dzogchen. And that pretty much mirrors the three views I've been talking about. Nundro practices kind of lean more towards traditional practices. Then the center is this whole system of tantric practices like the 6 yogas of Naropa, or deity practices, Kali Chakra Tantra, all of that. And then things like Mahamudra and Dzogchen are non-dual practices. At least they kind of lean in that direction. So that's why, by the way, that Vajrasattva's practice sounds kind of more traditional, is because it is kind of part of that phase of Tibetan Buddhist practices. But you can, one of the things that I like to say is any practice can be infused with whatever quality you want it to have. So you can do it in a traditional way, but you can do it with a tantric spirit too, or you can do it in a more non-dual way, so to speak. So to a large extent, you can kind of transform any practice that you're working with and infuse the view into it that you would like to. So that's just a comment about that. To get back to your main thrust there, Hans Christian. Yeah. When I made the comment about love, I'm not quite sure how you took that, but I didn't, I meant it in the spirit of the same way I was talking earlier about Satchidananda, how to me, Satchidananda describes the state of non-dual realization, it's not a description of Nirguna Brahman itself, or the Tao, or suchness. Similarly, love can't really completely describe the non-dual. That's why I say it's a relative reflection, but it is an expression of realizing the non-dual. When it's both a path to that realization and it's a fruit. You manifest boundless love as an expression of non-dual realization. In fact, I would say that that's kind of a way of conveying this notion of Shiva and Shakti is when the mind principle is transformed in the light of non-dual realization, it manifests as wisdom and clarity and luminous awareness, non-dual awareness. And when Shakti is transformed in the light of non-dual realization, it manifests as bliss and boundless life force and compassion and love. Other things too, but But so to keep it simple, we could just say, with love is Shakti's illumined form, and wisdom is Shiva's illumined form. All kinds of, keep it a little simple. You can enrich those, but that's the basic idea. Yeah. So does that help to kind of address this area that you brought up, Hans Christian?
Yeah. Well, yeah. You still need two camps there. So you're still kind of saying that love is kind of more like Shakti's quality, but I would, at least
You want to put it in the middle more?
Yeah. So that really, like you say, that love is an expression of, let's say, Nirguna Brahman is undefinable, but when it becomes, or when Satchidananda becomes expressed on a lower plane, it becomes love. And so love is like, when we talk about the great trinity of before anything is manifest, really. So love has to be there in order for manifestation to take place in the first place. So it has to be some sort of a really archetypical ground quality, rather than more like yeah.
There's certainly different points of view that I've encountered about this question. For instance, some people are inclined to say, well, wisdom is kind of more about non-dual, like Nirguna Brahman. The wisdom part of our nature knows the true nature of Brahman. And then love is how that integrates back into the world and relativity. It's what moves that to express within relativity. That's a version. I don't know if that's kind of similar to what you're saying, but it could be at least related in some way. My take on that is that I feel that wisdom is another attribute, and therefore in itself can't describe Nirguna Brahman. And so it's still part of relativity. And it's, to me, the transformation of mind. When mind reflects non-dual reality, it's wisdom, it's clarity, it's pure realization. And when feeling nature gets transformed, the body is kind of more feeling oriented, mind is more knowing oriented. When the feeling nature reflects non-dual reality, it's transformed into feeling leaning qualities like love and bliss. So that their marriage is something that in a certain sense is almost that their marriage is Brahman. The ultimate reality of their marriage is indescribable by an attribute. So for me, I don't put love or wisdom or any other quality in the middle, because that's sort of the mystery of their union. Any quality is something that ultimately is part of a distinction. And as we go deeper into profound non-dual realization, we realize the inseparability of love and wisdom, that they're really just two sides of the same coin. If we experience non-dual presence reflected in our feeling nature, it comes out as qualities like love. And if we experience it as reflected in our mind, it comes out as qualities like wisdom. And the more we realize the inseparability of the two, the more we have a hard time distinguishing them anymore. They're just a subtle distinction of the two sides of one reality, enlightenment itself. So that's my take. But there's plenty of room for different styles of interpreting these things. And yeah. So did you have any follow-up?
No, I think I will buy that. I think also, like you also said about Satchidananda, that Satchidananda cannot be separated. So it is one experience, which is only pronounced after you have after you step out of that experience. So when you are in that experience, there's nobody to express that. But when you're getting out of it, then the yogis and teachers and gurus and so forth, they talk about Satchitananda and say, yeah, there's Sat and there's Chit and there's Ananda, and these are the fundamental qualities of Brahman. But of course, in that experience, there's nobody to give that explanation. There's no objectivity to point to those things.
Right, right.
But yeah, in experiential level, for me in meditation, for example, when I'm conscious of the energies, when I'm observing, that's where both the wisdom and the love is being deepening. So it is kind of I think the same thing what maybe you were saying, that aren't they both like a product of interrelationship between Shiva and Shakti? Both love and wisdom are kind of a product of dialogue and interrelationship. So more you are aware of the energy, more wisdom and more love is being born. At least that's how it feels as an experiential level. When observing what's happening in meditation practice or daily life practice.
Yeah, part of the experiential reality of our life and our spiritual practice is that we are embedded in relative perspectives and states of being, and subsequently we're out of balance. Our true nature has never been other than that, but we understand it differently than that. So that's we sort of manifest that reality from our misunderstandings. So the reason that we make these distinctions about things like qualities, for instance, or mind and body, is because that's just a diagnosis of the problem that we already have, making those distinctions. And then part of the solution along the way can be to try to restore the balance by, for instance, if I realize that I'm out of balance towards mind, if I work with qualities like love, feeling, embodiment, connecting to my emotional nature, all things like that can be ways to bring about more balance, which becomes a doorway to realizing the interrelationship between these things. They always were interrelated. So that's an even deeper level, is to just open intuitively to a direct realization of how they always were. And I just wasn't experiencing it. But that's a more advanced stage. At another stage, it's like for instance, in Ayurvedic medicine, a core concept in Ayurveda is recognizing the elements. And so, for instance, energetically, the body is sort of vibrating to different frequencies, and those can be divided up as elements like earth and water, air and fire, and that's kind of simplified in Ayurveda into Kapha, Pitta, and Vata. These are like elemental conditions, more watery, more fiery, more airy. And disease in Ayurveda is in part recognized as an imbalance of these elements. So one way to learn about Ayurveda is you discover what's your constitutional type. Are you primarily Vata or airy with some fire as the secondary one, and you're weak on on Kapha? And then by knowing that, you can strengthen the Kapha, and that brings your whole body and psyche into greater balance, and then certain diseases will start to fall away because they're a result of that imbalance. So similarly in spiritual practice, even though at a deep level love and wisdom are radically interrelated, I might be in a state of consciousness where I've separated them and I'm more connected to one than the other. And by doing that, the degree to which I'm not in touch with true love and wisdom to that same extent, I'm not really in touch with the true nature of either, because since they're interdependent, you can't fully separate them. So if you torn them radically apart, that's when they turn into mind and body instead of love and wisdom. And so by saying, oh, well, if I'm so in my head, if I can get more in touch with my body and be more balanced between mind and body, and embody myself more, feel that part of my nature and honor it more and integrate it, that will actually awaken compassion and wisdom, because now you're harmonizing these two, and the harmonization of them is love and wisdom, which is just the manifestations of a more non-dual way of being. So on one level, it's a bit false to separate them in the first place, because their true nature always was that they were always in harmony. But that's at a deeper appreciation of the truth of what's already happening. At another level, when we're embedded in samsara, we're in the deep in the labyrinth, we kind of have to work with where we're at. Oh, I'm way out of balance over here, so I need to understand what's out of balance and how do I bring it into balance. And that's why we talk about spiritual qualities. Oh, I've got way too much equanimity and not enough engagement and caring and participation. So got to get more on the other side. Actually, the essence of equanimity is not at all incompatible with engagement. In fact, they radically empower each other. True engagement is inseparable from radical equanimity, and radical equanimity liberates your energy to be deeply engaged. They're not two things that you can have one and not the other. What you're really doing is realizing, oh, I kind of specialized in one, but I've gone as far as I can without realizing it's connected to the other. I have to bring in a broader understanding of the true nature of how enlightenment manifests. And we do that on one level by looking at spiritual qualities. And as that matures, then it actually kind of leads to something that even transcends the qualities, because it's so radically whole that it contains all of the qualities and balances all of the qualities. But even very advanced masters will exist in a state where they've attained non-dual presence as their inner realization, but their personality still has imbalances in it. It doesn't mean that the imbalances manifest as ego, but they are quality leanings. And they're still, as bodhisattvas, refining that and balancing that out at a relative level. Okay, any other comment or follow-up, Hans Christian?
No, I'm very satisfied. Thank you.
Okay. Anybody else in terms of the theme that we're talking about? Any of the questions that have been brought up? How are we doing for time? Oh, wow. That one flew by. So just in case we're at the end, but if there's any final comment or question about what we've been talking about, feel free to bring that up.
I just want to make a short comment and say that it was very illuminating to hear your description of the opposites and how they work, and now I think I realize and understand more about what the transformational path is about. Thank you.
Great. That's wonderful. Thanks for sharing. And you're welcome. Well, thank you all for coming. And I guess we'll get back to the Adi Buddha next time. But have a good week, and we'll see you next Sunday.